Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going way back to explore the Viking settlements in Greenland.
A fascinating story.
Yeah, it is. Everyone's always curious about how they managed to survive there.
Yeah, in such a harsh environment, yeah.
Exactly. What ultimately happened to them? We're going to use the English and Spanish Wikipedia articles to try to answer these questions.
It's a story of incredible resilience and adaptation, of course.
Definitely.
But ultimately, it's also a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, about how even the most successful societies
Can fail.
can fail, yeah.
Exactly.
So let's start at the very beginning. How did these settlements even get started?
Well, the story begins back in the year 900 with a sailor named Gumbjorn Ulfsson.
Okay.
Now, he was actually on his way to Iceland when he got blown off course and ended up sighting Greenland.
I see.
And he wasn't exactly impressed with what he saw.
I can imagine.
You have to picture a landscape just dominated by icebergs and these rocky islands,
Yeah.
Pretty desolate. Not a very inviting place to settle.
Not at all. But fast forward a few decades, and we meet Eric the Red.
Ah, Eric the Red, the famous,
Exiled from Iceland.
right, exiled from Iceland.
But he actually saw opportunity in this uninviting land, right?
I guess when you're exiled, any land looks good.
That's one way to look at it. But he explored the area and he came up with, well, what I consider a pretty clever marketing tactic. He decided to call it Greenland.
Greenland.
Yeah.
Interesting choice.
Yeah, he was hoping the name would attract settlers, and guess what?
It worked.
But by 985, he had convinced 14 shiploads of people to join him in establishing a new life in Greenland.
Wow, that's a lot of people. The promise of a fresh start, I guess. So where did they actually settle? There can't be that many, hospitable spots in this icy wilderness.
Right. Well, they established three main settlements: the Eastern Settlement, the Western Settlement, and the Middle Settlement. And
All right,
the Eastern
let's jump
Settlement
into
was
a
the
deep
largest
dive on
and
a
most
topic
successful.
you might not expect to
At
be
its
so
peak,
interesting.
some estimates put the
Tariffs.
population as high as
We're going to be
5,000
looking
people.
at the history of
That's
tariffs
amazing.
in the U.S.
You think of
through
Greenland,
the
you
lens
think
of
of,
Abraham Lincoln's
just this frozen
surprisingly
tundra.
strong
Yeah.
opinions
But to
on them.
think there was
Yeah.
this
It's the side of him you don't
bustling
often hear
Viking
about.
community
Right, you've
there.
got
It's
a
pretty
whole
incredible,
stack of
right? And
historical
we actually
articles
have
and excerpts
records
here.
of some of
Oh,
these early
yeah.
settlers.
Let's get into
Really?
it.
Yeah,
Sounds
the Land
good.
Nama
It's
book,
easy
which
to
is
think of
basically
tariffs
their
as just like,
version of
another dry
a
economic
history book.
policy,
Their
but
version of
in the
like a
early
saga?
U.S., they
kind
were
of,
it
really
lists names
central
like
issue.
Kirchhoff,
Okay.
The federal government
Patil,
relied
Raffin,
super
and
heavily on
Thorbjorn
tariffs
Glora.
for revenue,
Those are
no
some
income
serious
tax back
Viking
then.
names right
Oh, wow.
there.
So
Right.
the tariff rate
These guys
wasn't
were
just some number, it was
pioneers.
each settling in fjords that still bear variations of their names today.
Wow, that's pretty cool. It's like their legacy is literally etched into the landscape.
Exactly.
So we've got these intrepid Vikings arriving in Greenland, staking their claim. But I'm curious about what everyday life was like for them. Did they spend all their time, huddled in icy caves gnawing on frozen fish?
Not exactly. They were incredibly resourceful. They adapted a lot of the practices that they knew from Iceland. So, for example, they raised livestock.
Like what kind of livestock?
Sheep, goats, cattle. That provided them with food, wool.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about fresh produce? Did they have, thriving vegetable gardens in that climate?
No, not exactly. Supermarket abundance wasn't an option in Greenland.
Right.
But they did supplement their diet with this plant called kavan, or angelica. It's rich in vitamins. Think of it as their Viking multivitamin.
Oh, that's interesting. So they found ways to get their greens, even in that environment.
Yeah, they were pretty clever.
Makes you wonder who figured that out, right?
Right.
But still, meat must have been a major part of their diet, right?
Oh, absolutely. They relied heavily on hunting, particularly seals.
Seals, okay.
Later on, it's estimated that seal meat actually made up about 80% of their diet.
Wow, 80%. That's a lot of seal.
It was. They also hunted caribou for meat and hides, of course.
Right. It's funny, you think of Vikings, you think of those big feasts, roasted meats in these grand halls. Yeah, doesn't sound like that was quite the reality in Greenland.
No, not quite. And speaking of halls, you might be wondering what their homes and settlements actually look like.
Yeah, I am. Did they live in, simple huts? Or something a bit more elaborate?
Well, there's this remarkably well-preserved site called the Farm Beneath the Sand in the Western Settlement. It gives us a really fascinating glimpse into their lives.
Okay.
The house itself was actually built from peat sods.
Sods, okay.
Yeah, they stacked them up to create these thick, insulating walls.
Wow. I guess that makes sense in that climate. You need all the insulation you can get.
Absolutely. And this type of construction, might have actually been inspired by the Inuit who were already living in Greenland.
Oh, that's interesting. So there was some cultural exchange happening even back then.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Inuit had mastered building techniques for the Arctic climate.
Makes sense. They were the experts.
Exactly.
So, back to the farm beneath the sand. Did they find any, remnants of Viking feasts there?
Well, gourmet meals might be an exaggeration, but the food remains do reveal a pretty diverse diet. Yeah, they ate Arctic char, cod, ptarmigan, reindeer.
And seal, I'm sure.
Plenty of seal, of course. But what's interesting is they found evidence of both wild and domesticated animals, suggesting a pretty good balance between hunting and farming.
It's pretty amazing how they managed to make the most of what they had.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I imagine there were some pretty significant challenges too, right? Greenland's not exactly known for its abundant resources.
You're right about that. Wood and iron, essential for building and tools,
Right.
they were incredibly scarce in Greenland. They had to rely heavily on driftwood.
Which I imagine wasn't always reliable or high quality.
Exactly. And they often had to use whalebone as a substitute for iron.
Whalebone, really?
Yeah. Archaeologists have actually found a whalebone axe, which I think is just incredible.
Wow. Talk about resourcefulness.
Right.
But even with all their ingenuity, they couldn't have been completely self-sufficient, right? They must have traded with Europe.
Trade was absolutely vital to their survival. They exported some unique and valuable goods.
Like what? Frozen seal meat.
Huh, not quite. Walrus ivory was a major export, used for everything from art to tools. And then there were the narwhal tusks.
Narwhal tusks. Those are the ones that people thought could neutralize poison, right?
That's right.
It's like Viking unicorn horns or something.
Exactly. Highly prized in Europe.
I can imagine. So walrus ivory, narwhal tusks. What else was on their export list?
Well, they also traded ropes made from walrus hide, seal skins, wool, hides, and even live gerfalcons.
Gerfalcons. Wow, those are majestic birds. I imagine they were prized for falconry in Europe.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Among the nobility, especially.
So we've got these Greenland Vikings adapting to their environment, building a successful society, engaging in international trade. What about governance? Do they have any kind of government or social structure?
Well, they were big on self-governance. They had their own thing, kind of like a Viking parliament.
Viking parliament.
Yeah, where they would make laws and settle disputes.
Okay.
Their society was led by chieftains, but they didn't have a centralized government in the early years.
So it was more of a collection of independent communities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But that actually changed in 1261 when they chose to become subjects of the Norwegian crown.
The Norwegian crown, why would they do that? It seems like they were doing pretty well on their own.
Well, trade and protection played a major role. They needed regular shipments of vital supplies from Norway, and, being under the crown's protection probably felt safer.
Right, it makes sense. So things seem to be going pretty well. But I know their story doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah.
Before we get into their decline, tell me about their religion. I mean, the Vikings were known for their, let's say, enthusiastic pagan beliefs.
That's true, but the Greenland Norse converted to Christianity relatively early on.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's even a story about Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, playing a key role in bringing Christianity to Greenland.
Wait, Leif Erikson? The famous explorer who might have reached North America first?
That's the one.
Wow, he was quite the adventurer, both geographically and spiritually, it seems.
It seems so. Anyway, they built churches on their farms and even established a bishopric at Gerar, which was a major settlement in the Eastern Settlement.
Gerar. That sounds pretty impressive. What was it like?
Well, picture a bustling hub. You've got a grand cathedral, a bishop's residence, a busy harbor. It was clearly a center of power and influence in their society.
Are there any ruins left from this era?
Oh, yeah. Some are incredibly well preserved. The Havalsi Church is perhaps the most famous. The last recorded event there was a wedding in 1408.
A wedding?
Yeah, just a few decades before the settlements mysteriously disappeared.
A Viking wedding as a final act. That's almost poetic.
It is, isn't it?
But speaking of mysteries, we can't forget about the Inuit. They were already living in Greenland when the Norse arrived. What was their relationship like?
That's one of the big questions surrounding the Norse settlements, actually. We know they interacted, but the nature of their relationship is still debated.
So were they trading partners, rivals, or somewhere in between?
It's hard to say for sure. Some historians believe they were mostly peaceful, while others point to evidence of conflict.
Like what kind of evidence? Were there, epic battles between Vikings and Inuit?
Well, there is mention of a battle in the saga of Eric the Red.
Ah, the sagas.
with casualties on both sides. And then there's the Gotskalksannalar, which is an Icelandic historical record.
Yeah.
And it describes a possible Inuit raid in 1379, though some historians question its accuracy.
So it's a bit of a muddy picture.
It is, yeah. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
This is getting really intriguing. We've seen how the Norse established themselves, built this vibrant society, faced challenges, but what ultimately led to their disappearance. We've touched on possible conflicts with the Inuit, and I know there are other theories as well. What are the leading explanations?
Well, there's no single answer, no smoking gun. It was likely a combination of factors, each contributing to their demise.
So a perfect storm of challenges.
Yeah, you could say that. But we'll dive into those theories and try to uncover the mystery of the vanishing Vikings next time.
All right, sounds good. We'll see everyone back here for part 2 of our deep dives into the Norse settlements in Greenland. Okay, so where do we even begin to unravel this mystery of what happened to the Norse settlements in Greenland?
Right, well, the first thing to remember is they didn't just vanish overnight. It was more of a gradual fading out.
A slow decline.
Exactly.
So the Western settlement, that was abandoned first, right?
That's right, yeah. Sometime between 1850 and 1400,
Okay.
there's this Icelandic priest, Ivar Bararsson.
Okay.
He visited around 1350 and found it completely deserted.
Wow, just empty.
Yeah, can you imagine that? Sailing to a settlement that was once thriving and finding it completely empty.
Yeah, that's eerie.
Like something out of a ghost story almost.
Yeah, a bit. What about the Eastern settlement? Did they meet the same fate?
Eventually, yes. But they held on a bit longer.
Okay.
The last ship from Norway arrived in 1406.
That must have been a major blow, right? No more regular shipments of wood, iron, all those essential supplies.
It certainly put a strain on things. But we do have a few glimpses into their lives during those final years.
Really, what kind of glimpses?
Well, there's this record in the Icelandic Nýjan Annal, it's like a historical chronicle, about a ship arriving in 1408.
Okay.
And the captain, Horstein Olafsson, actually got married in the Falsey Church. Remember the one we talked about?
Yeah, the one with the last recorded wedding.
Exactly. And that's actually the last confirmed record we have of Europeans in Greenland.
So after 1408, it's pretty much radio silence.
Well, there are a few scattered accounts, but they're difficult to verify.
Like what?
For example, there's this Danish cartographer named Claudius Clevos.
Okay.
He might have visited around 1420 based on his maps and notes.
But no actual sightings of, like, thriving Viking settlements.
Not really. There were a few reported sightings, but nothing concrete. There's this account from an Icelandic bishop, Ugmundur Paulsson. He claimed to have seen people and sheep pens on the west coast in 1534.
And was that confirmed?
It's hard to say. And then there's a report in the Hamburg Municipal Archives of a ship from the Hanseatic League reaching Greenland in 1541.
Okay.
But they couldn't find any Norse settlers.
It sounds like more whispers of ghosts than actual evidence of a living community.
Yeah, it does a bit, doesn't it?
Were there any, less pleasant discoveries?
Sadly, yes. In the 1540s, a European ship reportedly found the body of a Norse man on a beach.
Oh, wow.
Dressed in traditional clothing with a worn-out knife by his side.
It's almost like a snapshot frozen in time.
It is, yeah. A pretty bleak picture, though.
Yeah, it is. So centuries pass, and the fate of the Norse settlements remains this big mystery. Did anyone ever actually go looking for them?
Yeah, there were a few notable attempts. John Davis, an English explorer, he was searching for the Northwest Passage in 1585.
Okay.
He encountered Inuit near modern-day Nuuk, but no sign of the Norse. And then there was Hans Eded, a Norwegian missionary.
Okay.
In 1721, he went to Greenland, hoping to convert any remaining Norse Greenlanders to Protestantism.
That's interesting.
But he found ruins in the Western settlement, but no Europeans.
So all this mystery, all this speculation, it's no wonder their story continues to fascinate us.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the big question, the why. Why did these settlements disappear? We talked about possible conflicts with the Inuit, but no, there are other theories as well. What are some of the leading explanations?
Well, there's no single answer, as we said before. It's probably a combination of things.
A perfect storm, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. A perfect storm of challenges.
Okay, so break it down for me. What were the key factors?
Climate change is a big one. The Little Ice Age.
Ah, yes, that period of cooling temperatures.
Right, and it began around 1400.
Which would have made life in Greenland even tougher.
Much tougher. It would have had a huge impact on their agriculture, their livestock, their ability to survive in general.
So even colder than usual.
Yeah. And there's actually archaeological evidence to support this. They found that skeletons from later burials are smaller, which could point to hardship and malnutrition.
So they were struggling to get enough food.
Yes, exactly.
It's almost ironic. Climate change, but in the form of a warmer period, that might have actually helped them settle in Greenland initially.
That's true. The climate was relatively mild during the medieval warm period, which made settlement possible.
Right.
But then the Little Ice Age hits, and it brings much harsher conditions.
And maybe they weren't prepared for such a dramatic shift.
It's possible. Maybe their early success made them less adaptable.
That's an interesting point. So climate change was definitely a factor. Were there other things at play?
Oh yeah, for sure. Environmental degradation likely played a role as well. Overgrazing their livestock could have led to soil erosion.
Ah, I see.
And then there's deforestation for fuel and building materials. That would have depleted those precious few trees they had.
So they might have actually contributed to their own environmental problems.
Yeah, it's a classic example of human activities having unintended consequences on the environment. And we see similar patterns even today.
Right, for sure. So we've got climate change, environmental challenges. What about the economic side of things?
Right. Well, remember how important trade was for these settlements?
Yeah, those narwhal tusks, walrus ivory.
Exactly. Well, there's evidence that the value of walrus ivory actually declined.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they faced competition from other sources, so that would have seriously impacted their ability to trade for the goods they needed.
So no more fancy narwhal tusks to trade for those essential supplies.
Pretty much. And that would have had a ripple effect throughout their entire society. Without access to things like wood and iron, life in Greenland would become even harder.
So we've got climate change, environmental challenges, economic hardship. It's starting to paint a pretty bleak picture. But I'm wondering if there were any other, maybe less obvious factors that contributed to their decline. Could their culture, their social structure have played a role?
That's a really interesting question. And some historians do believe that the Norse may have been too stuck in their traditional ways.
Okay.
Perhaps they were a bit resistant to adopting new strategies that could have helped them survive.
But they were so adaptable in the beginning, right? I mean, they managed to carve out a whole society in this incredibly challenging environment.
They were, but maybe that early success made them less willing to change when conditions worsened.
So they got a little bit too comfortable, maybe.
It's possible. Think about the Inuit. They had these sophisticated hunting techniques and tools perfectly adapted to the Arctic.
So maybe the Norse could have learned a thing or two from them.
It's definitely a possibility. They could have adopted some of their hunting methods, maybe some of their tools.
But it sounds like they were reluctant to learn from a culture they maybe saw as different or even inferior.
Yeah, there might have been some of that going on.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if they'd been more open to change. I mean, it's a reminder that even the most successful societies can become vulnerable if they fail to adapt.
And that's a valuable insight, and I think one that's relevant even today.
Right. We face so many complex challenges in the modern world.
Exactly. And understanding how societies adapt or fail to adapt can offer us some really valuable lessons.
This has been a fascinating journey so far, exploring the history of the Norse settlements. We've seen their origins, their culture, their successes, and now the factors that led to their disappearance. It's a story that just sparks so many questions about resilience, adaptability, and the relationship between humans and their environment. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what we can learn from this story. I mean, is it just a fascinating historical footnote, or does it hold some deeper meaning for us today? We've explored the rise and fall of the Norse settlements in Greenland, uncovered mysteries, debated theories. It's a story that just keeps unfolding the more we learn about it. But I think the biggest question is, what can we learn from their experience? Is it just a fascinating historical footnote, or does it hold deeper meaning for us today?
I think their story offers a lot of valuable insights into human resilience, adaptation, and the relationship between societies and their environment.
So it's more than just a tale of Vikings braving the cold.
Exactly. Their story reminds us that even the most successful societies can be vulnerable to forces beyond their control. I mean, these were incredibly skilled people, seafarers, farmers, traders. They adapted to this incredibly harsh environment, built communities, established trade networks. But when those conditions changed, they weren't always able to keep up.
It's almost tragic. You know, they achieved so much, yet they ultimately disappeared. What do you think were the biggest factors in their decline?
As we talked about earlier, it was likely a combination of factors. The Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, impacted their agriculture, their way of life, and then they might have overgrazed their land, depleted their forests, contributing to environmental degradation, and of course, the decline in trade, possibly due to factors beyond their control, would have cut off their access to essential goods.
It seems like they were hit from all sides. But if they were so adaptable in the beginning, why weren't they able to adjust to these new challenges?
That's a question historians are still debating. Some suggest they might have been too attached to their traditional ways, reluctant to learn from the Inuit who had already mastered survival in the Arctic. Just imagine if they had embraced Inuit knowledge. Things like kayaking, seal hunting techniques, building techniques, adapted to the extreme cold.
It's fascinating to think about what might have happened if they had been more open to learning from another culture.
It really is. And, it raises the question of how much they could have adapted even if they had wanted to.
That's a good point. We can't just assume they could have simply adopted Inuit practices wholesale.
Exactly. Their social structures, their beliefs, their technologies were very different. But I think their story highlights the importance of being open to new ideas and approaches, especially when faced with changing circumstances.
So it's not just about adopting specific practices, but about having a certain mindset.
It's exactly a mindset of flexibility and a willingness to learn from others. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of things. The Norse settlements didn't collapse because of one single factor, right? It was a complex interplay of environmental, economic, and social forces.
That's a perspective we often miss. I think even today we tend to look for simple cause and effect explanations, but reality is rarely that neat and tidy.
It's true, and the story of the Norse in Greenland reminds us that we live in a world of interconnected systems, climate change, resource depletion, social inequalities. These issues don't exist in isolation. They're all intertwined, and finding solutions requires a much more holistic approach.
It feels incredibly relevant to the challenges we face today. We're also dealing with climate change, resource scarcity, social and political upheaval. What are the most important lessons we can take away from their experience?
I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of environmental stewardship. The Norse might have contributed to their own demise through overgrazing and deforestation. We need to learn from their mistakes and prioritize sustainable practices. Imagine if they had managed their resources more carefully or adopted the Inuit practice of using every part of the animals they hunted.
It's about recognizing that we're part of these ecosystems, not separate from them.
Exactly, and I think their story also underscores the need for cultural understanding and cooperation. Imagine if the Norse had been more open to learning from the Inuit, exchanging knowledge and skills. Perhaps they could have ways to coexist and thrive together in a world facing such complex challenges. Collaboration and mutual respect are more important than ever.
It's a powerful message about the potential of bridging cultural divides, especially when we're facing shared challenges. But it's hard not to feel a sense of sadness about their disappearance. Is there a glimmer of hope in their story?
Well, while the Norse settlements in Greenland vanished, their descendants continue to thrive in other parts of the world, carrying their culture and traditions with them. I think their story reminds us that even in decline, there's a thread of continuity, a spark that carries forward. It speaks to the enduring power of human resilience, our ability to adapt, learn, and ultimately create anew.
It's a reminder that failure, while difficult, isn't always the end. It can be a catalyst for change, an opportunity to learn and create a different future.
Exactly, and it raises these important questions for us today. What choices are we making? Are we learning from the past, adapting to a changing world, and building a future that is both sustainable and equitable? The story of the Norse settlements in Greenland challenges us to consider these questions and strive for a future where we learn from the past, adapt to change, and build a world that thrives for generations to come.
That's an inspiring message to end on. It's been an incredible journey exploring the world of the Norse settlements in Greenland. We've uncovered mysteries, debated theories, and ultimately, I think, gained a deeper understanding of human history and its relevance to our world today. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that it inspires you to continue learning, questioning, and seeking a deeper understanding of the world around us.